Hey everyone, it's Rick, and thanks for joining me on another Inwyt Walkabout. I'm on a trail, I think similar to the one I was on last week when we were walking between some houses, a little bit in the wooded area between neighborhoods. We had a rainy weekend and it's finally starting to clear, which is very nice. I wanted to talk a little bit today about conflict in the context of, overt violence, the violence that dominates the headlines these days with the wars that are going on in the Middle East, in the Ukraine, and the violence that, generally is pervasive in the media wherever one looks. And I wanted to share a story that my mother told me about, again, from her experience as a child in Nazi Germany during World War II, where towards the end of the war, 1945, the Germans had largely been defeated, and my mother and her family, who ended up on the East German side, had the Russians essentially advance to their town, which was on the River Elbe, kind of became the border between the Russian advance and the American advance on the other side. But at that time, the Russians had basically moved into the town, and because my grandfather was a general practitioner at the time and had his hospital practice or his clinical practice in his house, they had a pretty large house. The Russian command basically took over the house and booted the family out, and they had to resort to living in an underground bunker in the backyard that they had dug out and sparsely furnished, and essentially were riding out the last days of the war in those conditions. And my mother shared how, she was one of six children. And one day, I think she was responsible for watching her younger kids. And all of a sudden she noticed that her younger brother, Uli, was missing, nowhere to be found. And so she was in a panic and, concerned that, he had somehow gone astray, and with the violence and the war that was going on around them, that he was in serious trouble. And so she started to look around in the yard and ultimately approached the house, and to her, I'll say, relief and surprise, there was her younger brother sitting on the lap of a Russian soldier, being at least guided through one of the children's books that, had remained in the house. And so, from my mother's perspective, it was obviously reassuring, but for her, it was also a message of, what I would say is hope and appreciation, that for all the violence and for all the ideologic differences, the ideas that, essentially this war was about, that underneath it, there was an element of humanity that still existed, even within the so-called enemy. So, what's the point of this? I think when we look at the wars that are going on, and just take an example, it doesn't matter what side you're on. This is not a sidedness issue. It's just war is conflict, and war is basically about ideas and contradictions and differences, and taking an aggressive, violent approach to trying to solve problems that, again, are based on division and fragmentation, and for which there really is no meaningful solution to be had. And the result is, lots of people get killed. Russian soldier death estimates in the Ukraine are in the 350,000 range. I think one estimate is. Think of the civilian deaths that are occurring on both sides in the Middle East. And again, just, what we sort of loosely term as collateral damage, the unfortunate side effects of war, the damage that causes. And here you have an example of, again, two sides in the story with my mom, where Uli, her brother, as a child, is the enemy technically. But in his young age, he was probably 5 or less, really probably had no understanding of, the differences and certainly what the ideology was that everybody was fighting for. And there he went, curious and innocent and vulnerable, if you will, to the house to explore and who knows what, just to basically see what was going on there. And the response of that approach with innocence, childlike vulnerability, if you will, because he was, brought something out within the enemy soldiers where, for whatever reason, their humanity and their core of whatever values they had shone through beyond or beneath the conflict. So that's, this is not really necessarily a message about the soldiers per se, because clearly there are soldiers who are very much damaged psychologically from war, as we know, with PTSD and suicide rates and so forth. So there's an inherent conflict, I think, that everybody who is fighting a war has, and for which, again, the arrival or the presence of the innocent child, maybe was a little bit of a breakthrough or a pause in the other side of the conflict that, was really driving the aggressive behavior and the violence. But I think, what I would point to maybe more for us is take this out of the context of war and say, what does this mean? What is this story? How is it relevant to complex problem solving in general? And I think, when I look at Uli and I look at the approach that ultimately breaks down divisions and at least creates a window for transformative change, is for people to show up, whether you're a leader or you're a participant in a complex problem solving team, to show up with curiosity and innocence and vulnerability. And not to do it intentionally because it's, for a child, it's an effortless act. The real challenge is, can we as adults hold on to, that core of innocence and just show up and, again, just look at what's going on without pulling in ideology, values that we're trying to uphold and to defend. And again, when it becomes particularly personal, to do so with violence. So, I think that's really one of the take-home messages for complex problem solving, again, is that you can't solve complex problems or any conflict with division, by taking sides. And the only way that you ultimately get to a shared understanding is to show up without your baggage, without your ideals, and without your constraints, your perceptions, and actually get to a point where you can collectively look at what is. And it's, for most people, my mother's a great example, that is a high risk opportunity. and something that, again, instills a lot of fear. But if one can look at it, and again, it's not about doing, it's about just understanding how showing up without hypothesis, without an objective, just being curious and just being neutral, being innocent, and looking at what's actually going on actually creates openings not only for the functional problem solving, but for engaging people who traditionally are either conditioned through being a soldier or through work ethic or whatever constraints or expectations are there. It enables potential breakthrough to drop that and actually to just, again, see what's going on. So that's it for today. I'll leave you with a view here as you kind of reflect on, again, whether it's possible to show up to situations where you generally are at odds or contradiction, and to just observe the contradiction, observe, that feeling of conflict again, and just see whether there's something beyond that allows you to actually see what actually is. You might see something. I hope you have a great day, a wonderful week, and I look forward to seeing you all next time. This is Rick with Inwyt Walkabout. Take care.